Imagine a place where the air smells of blooming jasmine instead of sweat, where the housing looks like a quaint village, and where every single face you pass is wearing a bright, wide smile. To any traveler passing through North Carolina in 1855, the Ashworth estate wasn't just a plantation. It was a miracle. It was the model institution, a place where the shackles were invisible and the cruelty was allegedly non-existent. But if you looked into the eyes of the men picking the tobacco, you wouldn't see joy. You would see the kind of absolute paralyzing terror that only exists when your own face is no longer your own. My name is Ruth. I arrived at the Ashworth gates in the spring, draped in the heavy iron and bitter memories of a rice swamp in the deep south. I was 30 years old and my back was a road map of every mistake I'd ever made under the lash. I expected the familiar sting of the whip. I expected the bark of the hounds. Instead, I was met with something that made my blood run colder than any winter frost. The wagon groaned to a halt before a man who looked more like a school teacher than an overseer. His name was Silas Vance. He didn't carry a lash. He carried a small silver-handled mirror. He looked at us four broken, exhausted men, and he didn't scream. He whispered, "Welcome home," he said, his voice as smooth as polished silk. "Here, we do not believe in the breaking of skin. Mistress Ashworth believes in the harmony of the spirit. We give you meat. We give you beds with linens, and we give you a life of peace. In exchange, you give us your smile." I looked at the men around me. They were confused. One younger boy, barely 19, let out a shaky laugh, thinking it was a cruel joke, but Silas Vance didn't laugh. He stepped forward and held the mirror up to the boy's face. "Smile, son," Silas whispered. "Show the mistress you are grateful." When the boy hesitated, his lip trembling with the exhaustion of a 3-day journey, Silas didn't strike him. He simply signaled to two large men standing by the gate. They didn't have whips. They had wooden masks, horrific carved things with frozen, leering grins. "He's struggling with his gratitude," Silas noted sadly. "Take him to the bright room. Let him find his joy there." The boy was led away, screaming, not in pain, but in a strange anticipatory horror. Silas then turned his gaze to me. His eyes were like two pieces of flat grey flint. "And you, Ruth, you look like a man who has forgotten how to be happy. We will have to work extra hard to fix that." As I was led to my cabin, I passed a woman hanging laundry. She looked at me and her mouth stretched into a wide toothy grin that looked like it had been stitched onto her face. But as she pinned a sheet, a single tear tracked down her cheek, rolling over that unmoving, terrifying smile. That was the moment I realized the Ashworth estate wasn't a paradise. It was a psychological cage where the bars were made of your own muscles. The cabin I was assigned to wasn't a shack. It was a sturdy whitewashed cottage with a glass window and a small porch. To any outsider, it was luxury. To me, it felt like a trap. I sat on the edge of the cot, the softness of the mattress feeling like a mockery of the scars on my back. The silence of the estate was the loudest thing I had ever heard. There was no singing from the fields, no rhythmic chanting to ease the labor, only a haunting force, quiet, punctuated by the occasional eerie sound of distant high-pitched laughter that didn't sound like laughter at all. An hour later, the door creaked open. It was the young boy from the wagon, Caleb. He walked in with a stiff mechanical gait. I stood up to ask him what had happened in the bright room, but the words died in my throat. Caleb was smiling. It wasn't a confused, nervous expression he had held earlier. His mouth was pulled back so far his gums were exposed, his cheeks bulging upward. His eyes, however, were wide and bloodshot, darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Caleb," I whispered, "what did they do?" "I am so grateful," he chirped. The voice wasn't his. It was a high, forced falsetto, thin and brittle. "Mistress Ashworth is so kind, and I love it here." He spoke the words as if he were reciting a prayer under a blade. He sat on his bed, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face never relaxing. Not even for a second. Stop it, I hissed, stepping toward him. It's just us. You don't have to do that in here. Caleb's smile didn't waver, but a small tremor started in his jaw. The walls are thin, Ruth. The mirrors, they watch the joy. He pointed to a small polished silver plate mounted near the ceiling. It wasn't just a decoration. It was angled to reflect every corner of the room back toward the door's peephole. I realized then that at the Ashworth estate there was no such thing as privacy. The kindness of the housing was simply a way to ensure there were no dark corners where a man could let his face fall into the comfort of his own grief. That evening we were called to the circle of appreciation. We stood in the center of the manicured lawn, the big house glowing with golden light behind us. Mistress Ashworth stepped onto the veranda. She was a delicate woman dressed in pale silks, holding a lace parasol as if she were a saint descending from a cloud. She looked down at us with a maternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "My children," she said, her voice like honey, "I see some new faces. I see some who have not yet learned the peace of a contented heart. Remember, a frown is a sign of a sick soul, and I cannot have sickness in my home." She began to walk among us, her silk skirts rustling. She stopped in front of me, the tip of her parasol touching my chest. "Ruth, you were a fighter in South Carolina, weren't you? You fought the lash, but here there is no lash. Why do you still look so burdened?" I felt Silas Vance's hand rest on my shoulder. His grip was light, but his thumb pressed into a nerve in my neck, a silent warning. I looked into her eyes and saw a vacuum of empathy. She didn't want my happiness. She wanted my performance. She wanted to look at her property and see a reflection of her own supposed goodness. "I am learning, mistress," I forced out, my jaw aching as I tried to pull the corners of my mouth upward. "Learning isn't enough, Roth," she whispered, leaning in. "By tomorrow's harvest, I expect to see the light of gratitude in your eyes. If not, I fear you'll need a longer session in the reflection cabin. And believe me, the mirrors there see much more than your face." As she walked away, the other captives began to hum a bright, upbeat tune, their faces locked in those terrifying grins. But as the sun set, the shadows on the grass looked like reaching claws, and I realized that at Ashworth, the only way to keep your mind was to lose your face. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. I looked over at Caleb's cot, and in the moonlight I saw him using his fingernails to carve a smile into the wooden headboard, his own face still locked in a grin, even as his fingers bled. The tobacco leaves were thick and sticky with morning dew, but the physical labor was the least of our burdens. As we moved through the rows, the silence was broken only by the overseer, Silas Vance, who paced the perimeter with a small handbell. Every time he rang it, we were required to stop and call out a blessing. "Bless the mistress for this son," one man shouted from 3 rows over. His voice was, his face a grotesque mask of forced delight. "Bless the mistress for the rain to come," a woman echoed. I kept my head down, my fingers raw from the stalks, trying to maintain the muscular tension required to keep my mouth curved, my face etched. It was a localized, burning exhaustion I had never known. In South Carolina, when you were tired, you slumped. Here, if your posture sagged or your expression neutralized, the bell would stop ringing, and the silence that followed. The bell was the most dangerous sound on the plantation. "You're slipping, Ruth," a voice whispered beside me. It was Sarah, the woman I had seen hanging laundry. Her hands moved with lightning speed, but her lips barely moved as she spoke through her fixed grin. "Your left side is drooping. Fix it before Vance sees. He's looking for a reason to make an example of the new fighter." I adjusted my expression, the skin of my cheeks feeling as though it might crack. "How do you do this?" I hissed back. "How do you breathe with this mask on?" "You don't breathe," she said, her eyes fixed forward, devoid of the sparkle her mouth suggested. "You disappear. You go somewhere deep inside behind your eyes, and you leave your face for them to play with. If you stay in your face, Ruth, you'll go mad. That's what happened to the ones in the reflection cabin." They couldn't leave their faces, so the mirrors broke their minds. Suddenly the bell stopped. The field went deathly still. Silas Vance wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Caleb, the boy who had been with me in the wagon. Caleb had stopped. He was standing in the middle of a row, his hands hanging limp, his face completely, terrifyingly blank. The smile had finally fallen. "Caleb," Vance said, his voice disappointment wrapped in velvet, "is the sun too bright today? Does the tobacco feel too heavy for your grateful heart?" Caleb didn't respond. He looked at Vance with eyes that were hollowed out. "It hurts," the boy whispered. "My face, it just wants to rest." "Please, just for a minute." Vance sighed, a long theatrical sound of regret. "Mistress says that a resting face is a breeding ground for rebellion. If you cannot find joy in the light, perhaps you will find it in the dark." Two smilers, large men whose expressions were so wide they looked like caricatures, approached Caleb. They didn't hit him. They simply took his arms and began to lead him toward the small windowless building at the edge of the woods. "The reflection cabin, no." Caleb shrieked, his blank face finally twisting into a grimace of pure honest terror. "I'll smile. Look, I'm smiling." He tried to pull his mouth back, but his muscles were twitching, failing him. He looked at me, a silent plea for help in his eyes, but I stood frozen. I knew that if I moved, if I let my own mask slip for even a second, I would be walking right behind him. Sarah's hand brushed mine in. "Tobacco leaves, don't look," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Keep picking, keep smiling. The mistress is watching from the balcony." I looked toward the big house. There she was, a pale spectre in a white dress holding a pair of silver opera glasses. She wasn't watching the harvest. She was watching the boy being dragged away, a faint satisfied curve on her own lips. It was then I realized her benevolence was a hunger. She fed on our performance of happiness. She didn't want our labor. She wanted to own the very nerves that moved our expressions. That night, the wind carried a sound from the woods, not a scream, but a rhythmic high-pitched scratching, like 1,000 fingernails trying to find a way out of a glass jar. The sun had not yet crested the hills when I was summoned to the big house. Usually, bound workers were kept far from the mistress's private quarters, unless they were domestic servants, but I was being called for a different purpose. Silas Vance led me through the back entrance past a kitchen that smelled of fresh baked bread and cinnamon scents that felt like a sensory assault compared to the rot of the tobacco fields. We entered a long hallway lined with mirrors, dozens of them, gold-framed, silver-edged, some convex and some concave, all of them polished to a blinding sheen. "Mistress Ashworth has a special task for you, Ruth," Vance said, his voice echoing off the glass. "She's noticed your resilience. She thinks you have the potential. Be a leader of joy, but first you must understand the philosophy of the image." I was pushed into a small circular room. It was the bright room. Caleb had mentioned the walls were entirely mirrored, and the ceiling was a dome of skylights that funneled the morning light into a concentrated white glare. In the center of the room sat Mistress Ashworth, sipping tea. She looked at me not as a man but as a sculptor looks at a stubborn piece of clay. "You have a very tragic face, Ruth," she said. Her voice is soft, melodic hum. "The lines around your eyes speak of South Carolina. They speak of bitterness, but bitterness is a heavy stone to carry. Why not set it down? Look at yourself." She gestured to the walls. I looked, and I saw 1,000 versions of my own broken spirit. I saw the scars on my neck, the exhaustion in my eyes, and the unnatural trembling curve of my mouth. Everywhere I turned, I was confronted by the man. I had become a prisoner of my own reflection. "A smile is a choice," she continued. Standing and walking toward me, she reached out with a gloved hand and touched the corner of my mouth. "When you smile, the world sees a happy woman's work. When you frown, you tell the world I am a failure, and I am never a failure, Ruth." She leaned in closer, and for the first time I smelled the sharp chemical scent of eldenum on her breath. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and utterly devoid of anything resembling human warmth. "Caleb is in the reflection cabin," she whispered. "Do you know what he's doing? He's looking at a mirror that doesn't move. He's looking at himself until he realizes that the only version of Caleb that exists is the one that is grateful to me. If he doesn't find that version soon, he'll simply fade away." I felt a surge of cold fury, but I forced it down into the deepest, darkest part of my soul. I knew that if I lashed out, I would be ending my chance to ever see Caleb or myself free again. I did what I had to do. I pulled my lips back, exposing my teeth, and I narrowed my eyes until they crinkled in a perfect imitation of delight. "I see the light now, mistress," I said, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. Her face lit up with a terrifying childlike glee. "Wonderful. Silas, give him the lead position in the north field. He is ready to show the others how to truly embrace their blessings." As I was led back out, I passed a door that was slightly ajar from within. I heard a sound that didn't belong in a house of peace. It was a muffled rhythmic thumping, like someone beating their head against a padded wall. Vance closed the door quickly, but not before I saw a glimpse of a wooden mask, the same one the guards had used lying on a velvet cushion. As I stepped back into the sunlight, I realized the masks weren't for the guards to wear. They were templates for our faces, and the mistress was planning to make mine permanent. The north field was the most visible part of the Ashworth estate, the section that ran alongside the main road where carriages of wealthy travelers would slow down to admire the smiling slaves. As the new lead, I was no longer just a worker. I was the conductor of a choir of ghosts. My job was to ensure that every row moved in synchronization and that every face was a beacon of artificial warmth. Silas Vance stood on a raised platform with his silver bell, but he didn't need to ring it as often now. The fear had settled into the marrow of the workers. They didn't need a bell to remind them to be happy. They only needed to look at me. "Keep the rhythm, brothers," I called out, my voice carrying a fake cheer that felt like glass shards in my throat. "Show the world how we thrive." Beside me, Sarah was failing. Her hands, usually so fast, were fumbling with the tobacco leaves. The fixed grin on her face was twitching, a muscle in her cheek leaping uncontrollably. It was the smile cramp, a condition that preceded a total mental break. If the muscles gave out, the spirit usually followed within the hour. "Ruth," she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't hold it anymore. My face feels like it's on fire. I think I'm going to scream." "Don't," I hissed, moving closer to mask her from Vance's view. "Think of the river. Think of the cold water in the swamp. Go behind your eyes, Sarah. Do it now." But it was too late. A carriage was approaching on the road, a black polished broom with gold trim. A group of northern socialites was inside, their heads popping out of the windows to witness the miracle of Ashworth. Mistress Ashworth herself was on the veranda, waving a silk handkerchief. This was the performance she lived for. Sarah's cheek gave a final violent lurch, and her face collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated grief. She didn't scream. She simply stopped, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The contrast was like a black ink stain on a white sheet. The carriage slowed. A woman inside gasped, pointing her fan at Sarah. The harmony was broken. The bell didn't ring. Silas Vance simply stepped off his platform and walked toward us. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father dealing with a wayward child. He reached Sarah and placed a hand on her head. "It seems the sickness has taken her," he said to the onlookers on the road. "A temporary lapse in her gratitude. We shall heal her in the reflection cabin." "No, please," Sarah cried, her voice finally breaking the silence of the field. "Just whip me. Just take the skin off my back, but don't take my face." Visitors looked uncomfortable, but Mistress Ashworth's voice rang out from the porch, clear and chilling. "See how she begs for pain. Her soul is so twisted by her former life that she rejects our kindness. Take her away for her own sake. As they dragged Sarah away, she locked eyes with me. She didn't ask for help. She looked at my perfect, wide, terrifying smile, the one I was forced to maintain even as my friend was taken to her doom. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of a monster. I realized then that by surviving, by playing the game, I was becoming the very thing that was destroying us. I was the master's favorite tool. That evening, Silas Vance handed me a small gift from the mistress, a silver-framed mirror of my own with a note that read, "Watch yourself, Ruth. You are almost perfect." The silver mirror sat on my small wooden table, reflecting the flicker of a single candle. In the distorted light, my face looked like a topographic map of a war zone. I stared at the man in the glass, and for the first time I didn't see Ruth. I saw a puppet. My own muscles had become traitors, twitching into a grin even when I was alone in the dark. The smile cramp was beginning to take hold of me, a physical manifestation of a spirit trying to claw its way out of a skin-tight cage. I stood up and walked to the wall where the small silver observation plate was mounted. I knew Silas Vance or one of his watchers was likely peering through a hole on the other side. I leaned in close, letting them see my perfect, terrifying gratitude. "Thank you, mistress," I whispered to the wall. "Thank you for the mirror I see now. I see everything." But as I turned away, I began to plan. If the Ashworth estate was a system of mirrors, then the only way to break it was to change the reflection. I remembered the bright room and the way the light was funneled from the roof. I remembered the scent of Eldinum on the mistress's breath, her own escape from the reality she had created. She wasn't a saint. She was a hollow shell who needed our happiness to fill her own emptiness. The next morning, while leading the crew in the North Field, I didn't just maintain the smile. I intensified it. I began to lead a new blessing. One that sounded even more devoted than the last. Bless the mistress for the walls that keep us. Bless the mistress for the mirrors that show us the truth. The other workers looked at me with a mixture of fear and disgust. They thought I had finally broken, that the reflection cabin had claimed my mind without me even entering it. But between the verses, I leaned toward a man named Moses, a veteran of the estate who had been there for 10 years. Midnight, I breathed, my lips barely moving behind the grin. The tool shed. "Bring the others who still remember their real names. You're a dead man." "Ruth," Moses whispered back, his own eyes darting toward Vance. "I'm already dead," I replied, a chillingly genuine laugh bubbling up that sounded like breaking glass. "I'm just waiting for the burial. At night I didn't sleep. I watched the moon crawl across the floor of my cottage. When the hour was right, I slipped out of the back window. The estate was eerily beautiful in the moonlight, a graveyard of whitewashed cottages and silent tobacco. I reached the tool shed where 5 shadows waited in the darkness. They were the ones whose eyes still held a spark of rebellion, the ones who hadn't yet been healed. "Why are we here?" Moses hissed. "Vance has the hounds. The mistress has the law. We have nothing but these cursed faces. We have the one thing they can't handle," I said, reaching into my coat and pulling out the silver mirror the mistress had given me. "The truth. They want a performance. We're going to give them a finale they'll never forget. We aren't going to run. Running is for people who want to be chased. We're going to stay, and we're going to show her exactly what her happiness looks like when the lights go out." I told them the plan. It was a gamble of highest order, a psychological strike against a woman who lived in a glass house of her own making. As I spoke, I saw their smiles finally drop. For the first time at Ashworth, we were 6 men standing in the dark, and we were allowed to be miserable. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. As we left the shed, a low, rhythmic thumping started coming from the reflection cabin again. But this time it was followed by a sound I had never heard at Ashworth. The sound of someone whistling a funeral march. The day of the grand inspection arrived with a suffocating humidity that made the tobacco leaves curl like scorched paper. This was the day the governor and his delegates were to arrive at the Ashworth estate to witness the pinnacle of benevolence. Mistress Ashworth was in a frenzy of perfection, her pale hands fluttering like nervous birds as she checked the alignment of every chair and the shine of every silver plate. She didn't know that the joy she had cultivated was about to become her most terrifying mirror. I led the Northfield crew to the front lawn. We were dressed in clean, starched white linen costumes for the play. As the governor's carriage pulled up the gravel drive, Silas Vance rang his silver bell with a frantic, joyous rhythm. "Smile, damn you!" He hissed as he passed my row. "If one mouth drops, I'll personally ensure you never see the sun again." I turned to the crew. I didn't whisper a warning. I gave a signal, a slight sharp tilt of my head. Suddenly, 40 men and women erupted into a chorus of laughter, but it wasn't the sound of mirth. It was a high, dissonant, shrieking cacophony that sounded like metal grinding on stone. We laughed with our mouths wide, our eyes bulging, our bodies shaking with a mechanical intensity that made the governor's horses rear back in terror. "Look at their spirit," Mistress Ashworth cried, though her voice wavered as she saw the governor's face turn pale. "They are overflowing with gratitude," but we didn't stop. We stepped closer to the veranda, our laughter growing louder, more frantic, more unnatural. We began to move in a jarring, rhythmic dance, our limbs jerking like puppets on tangled strings. The smile cramp that had plagued us individually was now a collective contagion. We were showing them the physical reality of the joy. They praised a madness born of suppressed agony. "Make them stop, Silas." The mistress whispered, her fan snapping shut. It's too much. Tell them to be quiet." Vance rang the bell. He rang it until his arm shook. But for the first time, the bell had no power. We were locked in the performance she had demanded. We surrounded the carriage, 40 faces with skin stretched so tight it looked ready to tear, 40 pairs of eyes screaming for help while the mouths refused to close. One of the visitors, a young woman, burst into tears and hid her face. "They look like demons," she wailed. "They aren't happy. They're broken. I am so grateful." I screamed over the laughter, my voice a jagged edge. "Bless the mistress for the mirrors. Bless the mistress for the silence." The governor stood up in his carriage, his face a mask of revulsion. "Ashworth, what in God's name is this? This isn't a plantation. It's a madhouse. These people aren't content. They are under a spell of terror." Mistress Ashworth's composure finally shattered. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second she saw the man behind the mask. She saw the rage I had SWN into every blessing. She saw that she had trained us so well in the art of the lie that the truth had become a weapon she could no longer control. As the governor ordered his driver to turn the carriage around, Silas Vance reached for his pistol, but he stopped when he realized that even as we laughed, we were all reaching for the silver-handled mirrors we had been gifted, holding them up to reflect the sunlight directly into his eyes. The blinding glare of 40 silver mirrors transformed the veranda into a wall of white fire. Silas Vance staggered back, shielding his eyes, his pistol firing harmlessly into the dirt. The governor's carriage sped away in a cloud of dust, the screams of the visitors fading into the distance, but we did not stop. We pressed forward, our laughter dying out into a heavy rhythmic breathing that sounded like a giant lung. The happiness had evaporated, leaving behind a cold crystal in focus. "The mirrors, mistress," I said, my voice now low and resonant, no longer forced into a falsetto. "You wanted us to see ourselves now. You're going to see what we see." Mistress Ashworth backed toward the open French doors of the manor, her silk skirts snagging on the rose bushes she loved so much. She looked at the circle of men and women closing in on her. We weren't holding knives or torches. We were holding the very tools of her psychological warfare. Every one of us held a mirror, a silver plate, or a polished tray, angling them to funnel the harsh afternoon sun onto her face, her dress, her eyes. "Silas, do something!" She shrieked, but Vance was gone. He had seen the look in Moses's eyes. the look of a man who had spent 10 years smiling at his own funeral, and he had fled toward the stables. The guards, the smilers, who had enforced the peace, stood frozen. They were captives too, and seeing our masks drop, had broken the spell of their own fear. We followed her into the house, the grand hallway. Once a gallery of her vanity became a hall of reckoning as she retreated. She tripped and fell against a massive floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. She looked up, and for the first time in her life she was forced to look at herself without the filter of her own delusions. She saw a woman who had fed on the souls of others, a woman whose beauty was a thin veneer over a hollow, rotting core. "Get away from me," she wed her voice thin and pathetic. "I gave you everything. I gave you cottages. I gave you meat. I never whipped you. You did something worse," Sarah said, stepping out from the back of the crowd. Her face was gone from her time in the reflection cabin, and her fingernails were gone, but her expression was something more powerful than a smile. It was calm, it was human. "You tried to take the only thing God gave us for free, our own grief. You tried to make our faces a lie so you could sleep better at night." Stepped forward and placed my silver-framed mirror on the floor at her feet. "The reflection cabin is empty now. Mistress Caleb is out. Sarah is out, but I think there's room for one more. I think you need to spend some time looking at the woman who thinks a smile is a chain." We didn't touch her, we didn't knee. The sound of the shattering glass was the final bell for the Ashworth estate. As the massive gilded mirror collapsed into 1,000 jagged shards, the image of the benevolent mistress was severed into 1,000,000 pieces. Mistress Ashworth sat in the center of the ruin, her silk dress torn by the glass, staring at a shard that reflected only her own wide, terrified eyes. She began to laugh, a high, thin, broken sound that mimicked the very madness she had forced upon us. The system had finally consumed its creator. We didn't wait for the dust to settle. We turned our backs on the big house and walked Moses, Sarah, Caleb, who had emerged from the woods like a ghost returning to the light, and all the others. We walked past the whitewashed cottages that were never homes. We walked past the tobacco fields that had been watered with the tears we weren't allowed to show. As we reached the edge of the property, I stopped and looked back the Ashworth estate. Once the happiest place in North Carolina looked like what it had always been, a graveyard of the living without our performance to sustain it. The grandeur of the house seemed to wither, the white paint looking like the bleached bones of a lie. The governor's report would eventually reach the papers, and the model institution would become a cautionary tale of the horrors of psychological bondage. "Where to now, Ruth?" Caleb asked. His face was weary. His mouth was set in a firm, straight line, and his eyes were finally beautifully sad north. I said, feeling the cool air of the woods on my skin, "to a place where we can frown when we are tired, weep when we are hurt, and laugh only when the joy is real." We left the mirrors behind. We left the silver bells and the bright rooms as the sun set. I felt the muscles in my face finally go slack. The smile cramp was gone, replaced by the heavy, honest weight of a man who owned himself. We were no longer reflections in someone else's glass. We were the authors of our own shadows.